The unseen wound. James Carter was a man who had everything, or at least that's what the world saw. As the CEO of Carter Enterprises, a technology empire he built from the ground up, he enjoyed immense wealth, fame, and success. His life was a montage of luxury cars, penthouse views, high-profile deals, and a revolving door of beautiful women who wanted a piece of his empire. But beneath the layers of extravagance was something he rarely acknowledged: emptiness. Tonight was supposed to be another celebratory evening, one that symbolized yet another milestone in his illustrious career. He had just secured a deal worth hundreds of millions, ensuring that his company would dominate the market for years to come. To commemorate the occasion, he had invited his new girlfriend, Vanessa, to an exclusive fine dining restaurant, a place where the elite wined and dined away from the prying eyes of the world. Vanessa was a stunning woman, tall, elegant, with the kind of beauty that turned heads wherever she went. She was also ambitious, always talking about luxury, travel, and networking with the elite. She was exactly the kind of woman James had gravitated toward ever since his divorce. No emotional baggage, no complications, just charm, sophistication, and beauty. As they sat at their reserved table, the restaurant hummed with low conversations, the clinking of fine glassware, and the soothing sound of a pianist playing in the corner. James should have been completely absorbed in the moment, basking in the glory of his success. Vanessa's laughter rang like a soft melody, her fingers delicately touching his hand as she spoke excitedly about their upcoming trip to Monaco. But something felt off. James couldn't quite place it, but there was a gnawing sense of unease in his chest. It wasn't Vanessa. She was flawless, as always. It wasn't the deal either. Everything had gone perfectly. And yet, a strange feeling of dissatisfaction lingered, creeping in like an uninvited guest. Then, in the middle of Vanessa's lively monologue about a gala she wanted to attend, James glanced away for just a moment. And that's when he saw her. Samantha. His breath hitched. The world around him blurred for a second, and the sound of the restaurant faded to the background. Standing behind the counter, dressed in a simple uniform, her dark hair pulled back into a tight bun, was the woman he had once promised to love forever. His ex-wife. And she was pregnant. James felt his entire body tense. His fingers curled against the crisp white tablecloth as he tried to process what he was seeing. Samantha, working here. He never imagined she would end up in a place like this, serving tables, clearing dishes, forced to take on exhausting shifts. And that belly. She was heavily pregnant. A wave of emotions hit him all at once: shock, confusion, disbelief, and something deeper, something more painful: guilt. Vanessa must have noticed his sudden distraction. She tilted her head, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her wine glass. "James?" she asked, concern flickering in her eyes. "What's wrong?" James swallowed, forcing himself to tear his gaze away from Samantha. "Nothing," he said quickly, but his voice was tight. "I just thought I saw someone I know." Vanessa followed his line of sight and frowned. "Who?" He hesitated. "No one important," he muttered, but the words felt like a lie even as they left his lips. Samantha, completely unaware of his presence, was focused on wiping down a table. She looked different, tired. Her once radiant complexion was pale, and there were faint dark circles under her eyes, evidence of long hours and little rest. And yet there was a quiet strength about her. Even in this difficult moment, she carried herself with dignity. James felt a knot form in his throat. How had it come to this? Their divorce had been bitter, fueled by his own arrogance and refusal to admit his mistakes. He had convinced himself that cutting Samantha out of his life was the best decision, that she was holding him back, that he needed freedom, that he was better off without the burden of a relationship. But now, seeing her here, carrying a child, working tirelessly to make ends meet, it felt like a punch to the gut. Vanessa was still watching him, suspicion growing in her gaze. "Are you sure you're okay?" she pressed. James forced himself to smile, but it felt hollow. Yeah, he lied. Let's just enjoy dinner. But he couldn't. His appetite was gone, and no matter how hard he tried, his eyes kept drifting back to Samantha. And each time they did, the guilt inside him only grew heavier. Then it happened. Samantha turned. For a brief moment, her eyes met his, and the shock on her face was unmistakable. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something. But then, just as quickly, she turned away and continued her work as if she hadn't seen him. James felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. She wasn't going to acknowledge him. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. And somehow, that hurt more than anything. He couldn't take it anymore. Without a word to Vanessa, James pushed back his chair and stood up. "Where are you going?" Vanessa asked, confused. "I need a moment," he muttered, barely sparing her a glance before striding toward the counter where Samantha was working. As he approached, he saw her tense up, her back stiffening as she pretended to focus on the dishes in front of her. He stopped a few feet away, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Samantha." She didn't turn around. "Samantha, please." Finally, she turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I'm working, James," she said flatly. "I don't have time for this." James exhaled sharply, searching her face for any sign of emotion. "You're pregnant," he said, his voice laced with disbelief. Samantha's eyes darkened. "That's none of your business." His jaw clenched. "Is it mine?" Her lips pressed together. "I don't owe you any answers." James took a step closer. "Samantha, please." A customer called her name, interrupting their conversation. Samantha immediately turned away and walked off, leaving James standing there, feeling more lost than he ever had before. He had spent years convincing himself that he didn't need her, that he had made the right decision walking away, that she had been just a chapter in his story. But now, standing in the middle of a restaurant, watching the woman he had once loved struggle to survive while carrying a child that might be his, for the first time in a long time, James Carter felt regret, and he had no idea what to do with it. Confronting the past, James Carter barely made it through the rest of the evening. Vanessa's voice became white noise in the background, drowned out by the overwhelming thoughts that flooded his mind. Samantha, pregnant, working late shifts, looking exhausted, was an image he couldn't shake. It haunted him, gnawed at the edges of his conscience like an open wound. By the time he dropped Vanessa off at her apartment, she had grown irritated with his obvious distraction. "What's going on with you tonight, James?" she demanded, arms crossed, her glossy lips pursed in frustration. "You've barely spoken since you got up from that table." James forced himself to focus. He knew Vanessa wasn't the type to let things go unnoticed. "I told you, it's nothing," he said, his tone clipped. She studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing. "It's that woman, isn't it?" His stomach tightened. "I saw the way you looked at her," Vanessa continued. "Is she an ex or something?" James sighed. He was in no mood for this conversation, but there was no point in lying. "Yes, she's my ex-wife." Vanessa blinked in surprise. She had known about his past marriage, but he had never gone into details. "And she's pregnant," she added, watching his face carefully. "Is it yours?" James didn't answer right away. That was the question that had been tormenting him all night. "I don't know," he admitted. "She wouldn't tell me." Vanessa scoffed. "Wow, that's messy." She tossed her hair over her shoulder, shifting in her seat. "Are you planning to get involved? I mean, James, you're a busy man. You don't have time to go digging up the past." James gripped the steering wheel tightly. "I don't know what I'm doing yet," he said honestly. Vanessa exhaled dramatically. "Well, do me a favor. Figure it out before I get dragged into it." With that, she leaned over, kissed him lightly on the cheek, and stepped out of the car, heading into her building without another word. James sat there for a moment, staring out the windshield. The city lights flickered in the distance, but all he could see was Samantha. He knew he wouldn't be able to rest until he had answers. A sudden realization. That night, James lay awake in his penthouse, staring at the ceiling. His mind replayed every detail of his marriage. The good, the bad, and the ugly. He had met Samantha when he was still clawing his way to the top. Back then, she had been his anchor, the one person who believed in him when no one else did. She had sacrificed so much for him. Her time, her career, her dreams, all because she trusted him to build something great for both of them. And what had he done in return? He had let success change him. As his business flourished, so did his ego. He stopped valuing Samantha's presence, stopped listening to her, stopped appreciating everything she did for him. And when the temptation of wealth and power had come knocking, he hadn't hesitated to betray her trust. The divorce had been inevitable, and at the time, he had convinced himself that it was for the best. But now, seeing her again, struggling on her own, carrying a child that might be his, he felt the weight of his past decisions in a way he never had before. He needed to talk to her, properly. The investigation. The next morning, James picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in months. Liam. James? It's early. What do you want? Liam sounded groggy, likely nursing a whiskey hangover. I need your help, James said, sitting up. It's about Samantha. There was a pause on the other end before Liam sighed. What now? You two haven't spoken in months. I saw her last night, James admitted. She's working as a waitress, and she's pregnant. The silence that followed was heavy. Then, pregnant, Liam repeated, now fully awake. James, is it yours? I don't know, James muttered. She wouldn't tell me. But I need to find out. Liam sighed again. Are you sure you want to open that door? If the baby is yours, what then? Are you ready to take responsibility? James ran a hand down his face. I don't know, he admitted. But I can't ignore this. There was a pause before Liam finally said, I'll see what I can find out. Thanks. James ended the call and exhaled slowly. He wasn't sure where this road would lead, but he knew he had to take the first step. The confrontation. Later that evening, James found himself standing outside the restaurant where Samantha worked. The neon sign flickered above him, and through the glass windows, he could see her moving between tables, balancing trays with practiced ease. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. Samantha noticed him immediately. Her body stiffened, her expression hardening as she turned away and continued working. But James wasn't going to let her ignore him this time. He waited until she passed by his table before speaking. Samantha. She didn't stop. Samantha, please. She turned sharply, glaring at him. James, I'm working. Whatever you want to say, it can wait. No, it can't. He met her gaze, unwavering. We need to talk. She exhaled heavily, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. Then, with a quiet, tense voice, she said, Fine. Meet me outside in 10 minutes. James nodded and walked out, standing near the alley behind the restaurant. The cool night air did little to calm his nerves. A few minutes later, Samantha stepped out, arms crossed over her chest. Make this quick, she said. I don't have time for this. James swallowed hard, his throat dry. Are you going to tell me the truth? Samantha's jaw clenched. What truth? Is the baby mine? She looked away, a shadow of pain flickering across her face. That's none of your business, James. His patience snapped. The hell it isn't. If that's my child, I deserve to know. Samantha turned back to him, fire in her eyes. Oh, now you care. Now you suddenly want to be involved. Where was this concern when I needed you, James? When I begged you to just be present in our marriage? When you were too busy chasing money and other women to even notice I was drowning? James took a step back, her words hitting him like a punch to the gut. Samantha shook her head. You don't get to walk back into my life and demand answers just because it's convenient for you now. James exhaled shakily. Samantha, Please, I just need to know." She stared at him for a long moment. Then, finally, she whispered, "Yes." James felt the world tilt. "Yes, James," she continued. "He's yours." He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Samantha sighed. "But that doesn't change anything. I don't want anything from you. I don't need your money. I don't need your help. And I definitely don't need you showing up at my job, making things harder for me." James ran a hand through his hair, struggling to find his voice. I don't know how to fix this." Samantha's expression softened, just slightly. "You can't," she said. "Not with words." She turned and walked away, leaving James standing alone in the cold night air, drowning in the consequences of his past. The weight of regret. James stood outside the restaurant long after Samantha had disappeared into the night. The weight of her words pressed down on him like an invisible force, making it difficult to breathe. He was going to be a father. The realization hit him like a freight train. He had spent years focused on himself, his business, his success, his own ambitions, never stopping to think about the lives he had affected. And now, the one person who had stood by him when he was nothing was struggling alone, carrying his child, while he had been obliviously living in luxury. A father. The word felt foreign. James Carter had never planned on having children. Not because he hated the idea, but because he had never seen himself as the kind of man who could be a father. His own father had been absent, a ghost in his life who had left nothing behind but disappointment and a legacy of broken promises. James had sworn never to be like him. And yet here he was, repeating history. No, he refused to let that happen. Taking a deep breath, James pulled out his phone and called the only person who could talk sense into him, a friend's advice. William picked up on the third ring. "James, it's late," he muttered, groggy. "I need to talk," James said, pacing the sidewalk. There was a long pause before Liam sighed. "Let me guess. Samantha." "She told me," James admitted. "The baby is mine." Liam let out a low whistle. "Damn." James leaned against the cold brick wall of the building, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what to do. Man, she won't even look at me. She doesn't want my help." Liam's voice softened. "Can you blame her?" James exhaled sharply. "No, but I can't just walk away from this. Liam, I won't." There was another pause. Then Liam said, "You want my advice?" "Yeah. Stop trying to fix everything overnight," Liam said. "You screwed up, James. Bad. You betrayed her, abandoned her, and now, just because you feel guilty, you think you can swoop in and make things right. It doesn't work like that." James clenched his jaw. "So what do I do?" "You prove yourself," Liam said simply. "Not with words, with actions, and not for a week or a month, but for as long as it takes. You want to be a father. Then act like one. And that starts with earning back her trust." James closed his eyes, absorbing the words. "Trust is built over time," Liam continued. "You're not entitled to it. You have to earn it. And you better be ready for the possibility that she might never fully forgive you." James swallowed hard. That was the part he feared the most. "Thanks, Liam," he said, his voice hoarse. "Don't thank me yet," Liam muttered. "Just don't screw this up." A silent promise. James drove home that night with a new sense of purpose. He knew Samantha wouldn't make this easy for him. He didn't deserve for it to be easy. But if there was even a sliver of a chance that he could make things right, not just for himself, but for the child growing inside her, he had to try. The next morning, James called his assistant, Claire. "I need you to do something for me," he said. "Of course, Mr. Carter," Claire replied. "I want information on Samantha," James said. "Not anything invasive, just enough to know how she's doing, where she lives, what she needs, if she's safe." Claire hesitated. "Understood, sir." James ended the call and stared out the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse. The city stretched before him, but for the first time in his life, it all felt meaningless. An unexpected visit. Days passed without contact from Samantha. She ignored his texts, avoided him whenever he showed up at the restaurant. He knew he had to give her space, but the frustration was eating away at him. Then, one evening, there was a knock at his door. When he opened it, he was stunned to find Samantha standing there. She looked exhausted, her face pale, her shoulders tense. "I need a favor," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. James blinked. He had been prepared for rejection, for hostility. But not this. "Of course," he said quickly. "Come in." Samantha hesitated before stepping inside. She glanced around his pristine penthouse, so different from the world she now lived in. "I lost my apartment," she said finally. "The landlord raised the rent, and I can't afford it. I need somewhere to stay, just for a few nights, until I figure things out." James felt a lump form in his throat. The idea of her being out on the streets, pregnant, struggling, made his stomach churn. "You can stay here," he said without hesitation. Samantha's eyes flickered with something. Reluctance, maybe. But she nodded. "Just for a few days," she emphasized. "I don't want charity, James." "This isn't charity," he said softly. "It's the least I can do." Samantha looked away, clearly uncomfortable. James took a deep breath. "I'll prepare a guest room for you." "Thank you," she murmured. James nodded, but as he watched her, a fierce determination settled in his chest. This was his chance to prove to her that he was more than the man who had failed her, and he wasn't going to waste it. A house full of ghosts. Samantha stood awkwardly in the center of James's penthouse, arms crossed over her swollen belly, feeling painfully out of place. The last time she had been here was months ago, before everything had fallen apart. Back then, she had been the wife of a billionaire, surrounded by luxury she once thought was a symbol of their love and success. Now she was just a struggling woman with nowhere else to go. James had prepared a guest room for her, a beautiful space with a king-sized bed, warm lighting, and a panoramic view of the city. It was more than she could have asked for, but it still didn't erase the tension between them. "I set up the room for you," James said, keeping his distance. "There are fresh towels in the bathroom. If you need anything, just let me know." Samantha nodded stiffly. "Thanks." She turned to leave, but James stopped her. "Samantha, I meant what I said. This isn't charity. You don't have to feel like you owe me anything." She exhaled sharply. "I don't feel like I owe you anything, James. That's the point." The words stung, but James didn't argue. She disappeared down the hall, leaving him standing there alone, the weight of her presence pressing on his chest like an invisible force. Memories in the dark. That night, Samantha lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The penthouse was quiet, almost eerily so. It reminded her of the countless nights she had spent here alone, while James had been out at corporate events, business meetings, or, she had later found out, entertaining other women. She closed her eyes, willing the memories away. She wasn't here to relive the past. She was here because she had no choice. But still, she couldn't shake the feeling that this place was full of ghosts. Ghosts of the love they once had, of the pain that followed, of the betrayal that had broken her. In the room down the hall, James was wide awake too. He sat on the edge of his bed, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the floor. He had spent years convincing himself that his past mistakes didn't matter, that money, power, and success could erase any damage he had caused. But Samantha's presence in his home was a painful reminder that some wounds couldn't be covered with wealth. He had destroyed the best thing in his life. And now, even with her just a few doors away, she still felt like a million miles out of reach. Unspoken tensions. The next morning, James found Samantha in the kitchen, making tea. The sight was strangely domestic, a memory of a life they had once shared. "Morning," he said cautiously. Samantha barely glanced at him. Morning. James hesitated before speaking again. I was thinking, since you're here, maybe I could help with the baby. Get a few things you might need. Samantha exhaled, setting her mug down. James, I don't need your money. It's not about money, he said quickly. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I want to help, Samantha. I know I can't erase the past, but I want to at least do this right. She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Doing this right means understanding that I'm not dependent on you. I know that, James said, but that doesn't mean I shouldn't be there. Samantha crossed her arms. You weren't there when it mattered, James. You were too busy with your empire, with other women. James flinched. I know. Then why now? She pressed. Why suddenly care? James took a step closer, his voice softer now. Because seeing you that night at the restaurant made me realize how badly I failed you, and I can't live with myself if I keep failing you now. Samantha looked away, her jaw tightening. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that he had changed, but she had trusted James before, and he had shattered her. I don't know if I can let you in again, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. James nodded slowly. Then I'll wait, and I'll prove to you that I mean it. A step forward. Over the next few days, James tried to keep his word. He didn't push Samantha, didn't demand answers or force conversations. Instead, he showed up in small ways, making sure the kitchen was stocked with the foods she liked, leaving warm blankets in her room, offering to drive her to her doctor's appointments. Samantha remained guarded, but she noticed. One afternoon, as she sat on the couch rubbing her belly, James walked in holding a neatly wrapped package. What's that? She asked warily. James hesitated before handing it to her. Just something for the baby. Samantha took the package, carefully unwrapping it. Inside was a small, handmade baby blanket, a soft blue material with tiny stars stitched into the fabric. Her breath caught. She ran her fingers over the fabric, recognizing the craftsmanship. She swallowed hard. This is like the one my grandmother made for me when I was a baby. James nodded. I remember you telling me about it once. I had someone recreate it. Samantha blinked rapidly, emotions swirling inside her. She looked up at James, searching his face. Why are you doing this? James exhaled. Because I don't want to be the man who let you down anymore. For the first time since she had moved in, Samantha felt something shift inside her. She didn't say anything, but as she held the blanket close, she realized that for the first time in a long time, she wasn't entirely alone. And maybe, just maybe, James Carter was finally learning what it meant to love. Cracks in the walls. Samantha held the baby blanket close, her fingers running over the soft fabric. She didn't want to admit it, not to James, not even to herself, but something about this gesture stirred emotion she had buried deep. James stood in front of her, waiting, watching, as if afraid to say the wrong thing and shatter the fragile moment between them. Finally, she let out a soft sigh and placed the blanket on her lap. This doesn't change anything, she murmured. James nodded, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet determination. I know, but I'm not giving up. Samantha exhaled heavily. She was tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of carrying the weight of her past. Tired of holding on to resentment like a shield. But she wasn't ready to let it go either. James, she said slowly, looking him directly in the eyes. I don't know if you understand how much you hurt me. You didn't just cheat on me. You made me feel invisible. Like I was nothing. Like I was just in the way of your success. James swallowed hard. She shook her head, pain flickering in her expression. Do you know what it was like? Watching you build an empire, standing beside you as you climbed higher and higher, only to realize that I was just another stepping stone you outgrew. James stepped closer, guilt etched into every feature of his face. Samantha. She cut him off, her voice sharp. No, you don't get to apologize and think that makes everything better. You don't get to act like a hero just because you feel guilty now. You walked away, James. You chose a life without me." Her words hit him like a gut punch. He had spent so much time focused on his own pain, his own regret, that he hadn't truly thought about what Samantha had endured. "I was selfish," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "I was arrogant. I thought I had everything figured out. And I thought you'd always be there. That no matter how much I messed up, you'd still be waiting." Samantha let out a bitter laugh. "Well, you were wrong." James nodded slowly. "Yeah, I was." The room fell into silence, the air thick with emotions neither of them knew how to process. Finally, Samantha exhaled sharply and ran a hand over her face. "I can't do this right now," she muttered. James took a step back, respecting the boundaries she was setting. "Okay, I get it." Samantha stood up, still holding the blanket, and turned toward the guest room. But just before she disappeared behind the door, she hesitated. "Thank you," she said softly, not looking at him. James nodded, but before he could respond, the door clicked shut. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even acceptance, but it was something. And for now, that was enough. A quiet shift. The next few days passed in a strange rhythm. Samantha remained guarded, but there were cracks in her walls now. Small ones, barely noticeable, but there nonetheless. James noticed the way she no longer flinched when he entered the room. The way her tone, though still firm, had softened slightly. The way she absent-mindedly ran her fingers over the baby blanket he had given her when she thought he wasn't looking. One evening, as James was working late in his home office, he heard a knock at the door. He turned, surprised, to find Samantha standing there, arms crossed. "Do you still have a driver?" she asked. James blinked. "Yeah, of course." She hesitated before speaking again. "I have a doctor's appointment tomorrow. I was going to take the bus, but if he's available, I could use the ride." James straightened up. "I'll take you myself." Samantha opened her mouth, probably to protest, but James cut her off before she could argue. "You don't have to say anything. Just let me do this." She sighed, but eventually nodded. "Fine. 2 p.m. "I'll be ready," James promised. And for the first time in months, Samantha let herself believe, just a little, that maybe James was serious about changing. A doctor's visit, and a moment of truth. The next day, James found himself sitting in a sterile white waiting room, surrounded by expecting mothers and nervous fathers. He felt out of place, like he didn't belong here. But when Samantha walked out of the exam room, a small ultrasound photo in her hands, all of that faded. James stood up immediately. "How did it go?" Samantha hesitated before handing him the photo. For a moment, James just stared at it. It was small, grainy, just a black and white outline. But it was real. His child. His son. His hands trembled as he ran his fingers over the image, swallowing against the lump in his throat. "He's healthy," Samantha said quietly. James looked up at her, emotion swirling in his eyes. He repeated. She nodded. "It's a boy." James couldn't breathe. A son. He had spent his whole life running from the idea of family, afraid he would turn into the kind of man his own father had been. But now, looking at that tiny figure on the ultrasound, he knew he had a choice. He could either keep running, or he could finally step up and be the man his son deserved. James looked at Samantha, his voice raw with emotion. "I won't let him grow up without a father." Samantha searched his face, as if looking for signs of deception. "Then prove it," she said simply. And James, for the first time in his life, knew he would. A father's redemption. James Carter wasn't the kind of man who second-guessed himself. In business, he made decisions with ruthless efficiency, never hesitating, never looking back. But as he sat in his penthouse that night, staring at the ultrasound picture of his son, he realized he had never been more uncertain in his life. He had spent years building his empire, believing that wealth and power were the only things that mattered. But now, holding this fragile piece of paper in his hands, he understood something he had never truly grasped before. Success meant nothing if you had no one to share it with. For the first time in his life, James wasn't thinking about deals or profits. He was thinking about the tiny life growing inside Samantha, the child he hadn't even known existed until a few days ago. And he was terrified. A rocky coexistence. Samantha's presence in the penthouse had shifted something in James's world. At first, she had remained distant, keeping to herself, refusing to engage in anything beyond the necessary. She stayed in the guest room, made her own meals, and avoided long conversations. James had respected that, but he hadn't given up. Instead of forcing his presence on her, he showed up in small ways, making sure she had everything she needed, preparing meals even when she refused to eat with him, stocking the fridge with her favorite foods. Little by little, the walls between them began to erode. One night, as he was working late in his home office, he heard a knock at the door. "Samantha," he said, surprised to see her standing there. She looked hesitant, her arms crossed over her belly. I can't sleep," she admitted. James gestured to the couch. "You want to sit?" She hesitated for a moment before nodding, stepping inside and lowering herself onto the leather cushions. For a while, neither of them spoke. James finally broke the silence. "Is the baby okay?" Samantha nodded. "Yeah. He just kicks a lot at night. Makes it hard to get comfortable." James hesitated before asking the question that had been weighing on his mind. "What's he like?" Samantha blinked. "What do you mean?" James stared down at his hands. "I mean, what do you know about him already? Does he have a strong heartbeat? Does he move a lot? What do they say about him?" Samantha was quiet for a long moment. Then, to James's surprise, she smiled. A small, tired smile, but a smile nonetheless. "He's stubborn," she said softly. "Every time the doctor tries to get a good look at him during ultrasounds, he moves around too much. He's active, restless. I can already tell he's going to be a handful." James chuckled, something warm and unfamiliar spreading in his chest. "Sounds like his mother." Samantha shot him a look, but there was no real anger in it. "And his father," she admitted. James exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I want to be there, Samantha. For him. For you." She looked away. "I know you say that now, but I need to see it. I need to know you won't disappear the second things get difficult." James met her gaze, his voice quiet but firm. "I won't." She didn't answer, but for the first time since she had moved in, James felt like she might actually believe him. Building trust, one step at a time. Over the next few weeks, James and Samantha fell into an unspoken routine. James drove her to her doctor's appointments, sitting quietly beside her as they listened to the baby's heartbeat. He bought baby books and left them in the living room, never pushing her to read them, but making sure she knew he was taking this seriously. One day, Samantha walked into the penthouse to find an entire nursery set up in one of the spare rooms. "What is this?" she asked, staring at the beautifully decorated space. Soft blue walls, a crib, shelves filled with tiny clothes and baby books. James stood awkwardly beside her, hands in his pockets. "I just thought he should have a place here, in case you ever need it." Samantha ran her fingers over the edge of the crib. "James, I know you don't trust me yet," he said before she could protest. "And I know I can't buy my way back into your life. But this isn't about me. It's about him. I want to be ready for him, no matter what happens between us." Samantha exhaled, her eyes flickering with something James couldn't quite read. "It's nice," she admitted, "but let's just take this one step at a time." James nodded. One step at a time. An unwanted interruption. Just as things between James and Samantha were beginning to stabilize, an unwelcome presence returned to stir the pot. Vanessa. James had all but forgotten about his former girlfriend, too consumed with trying to rebuild his relationship with Samantha. But Vanessa hadn't forgotten about him. One afternoon, as James was leaving a meeting, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. Vanessa. He sighed, considering ignoring it, but knowing Vanessa, she wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted. James. She greeted smoothly when he answered. Been a while. James pinched the bridge of his nose. Vanessa. I'd save it. She cut him off. I heard about your little reunion with your ex. Thought I'd check in, see how that's going. James's jaw tightened. It's none of your business. Oh, come on, James. We had fun, didn't we? Her voice was laced with something almost taunting. Now you're suddenly playing house with the woman you swore you were done with. James exhaled sharply. Vanessa, I'm not doing this with you. Are you sure? She purred. Because I seem to remember a time when you didn't give a damn about Samantha or her feelings. Remember how much fun we had laughing about how boring she was, how she wasn't exciting enough for you. James closed his eyes, guilt washing over him. That man doesn't exist anymore, he said tightly. Vanessa laughed. Oh, James, do you really think she'll ever believe that? James didn't answer. He ended the call without another word. But Vanessa's words stuck with him, lingering in the back of his mind like a poison. Did Samantha believe him? Or was she just waiting for him to disappoint her all over again? A turning point. That night, James found Samantha sitting on the couch, flipping through a parenting book he had left on the coffee table. She looked up when he entered the room. Hey. James hesitated before sitting across from her. Samantha, do you think I can change? She frowned slightly. What? I mean it, James said. Do you think I can actually be the kind of man you and our son need? Samantha studied him for a long time before finally speaking. I think people can change, she admitted, but only if they really want to. James swallowed. I want to. She sighed, looking down at the book in her lap. Then prove it. James nodded, determination settling in his chest. He would. For Samantha. For their son. And for himself. A future worth fighting for. James Carter had spent his life chasing success, but now, for the first time, he was chasing something else. Redemption. The past weeks had been the most humbling of his life. Every instinct told him to take control, to force a resolution, to fix everything with the snap of his fingers. But Samantha wasn't a business deal. She wasn't a problem to be solved. She was the woman he had loved and betrayed. And now she was the mother of his child. James knew that no matter how much he tried, there was no quick fix for the damage he had caused. But step by step, day by day, he was proving, to Samantha and to himself, that he was not the same man he had been before, and he would keep proving it for as long as it took. A moment of truth. One evening, as James sat in his home office going over financial reports, he heard a quiet knock on his door. He looked up to find Samantha standing there, hesitating. Samantha, he said, setting his papers aside. Everything okay? She looked uncertain, almost nervous. Ida wanted to talk to you. James straightened, his pulse picking up. Of course. Samantha stepped inside, closing the door behind her. She ran a hand over her belly, as if gathering her thoughts. I've been thinking a lot, she began, about everything. About the past. About the baby. James swallowed hard. He knew this moment was coming, but he wasn't sure if he was ready for what she was about to say. Samantha looked up, meeting his gaze. I need to know something, James, and I need you to be completely honest with me. James nodded. Anything. Why now? She asked, her voice quiet but firm. Why did it take seeing me in a restaurant, pregnant and struggling, for you to care? James exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Because I was blind before, he admitted. I convinced myself that what I did to you wasn't as bad as it really was, that I had the right to move on, to be happy, to live my life without looking back. He shook his head, shame tightening his chest. But seeing you that night, it was like someone ripped the blindfold off. I realized how much I hurt you, how much I threw away. And when I saw you pregnant," his voice wavered, "it hit me that I hadn't just hurt you. I had abandoned my own child before he was even born." Samantha's expression softened slightly, but she still looked wary. "And what about Vanessa?" James flinched. He had been hoping to avoid this part of the conversation, but Samantha deserved the truth. "Vanessa was never real," he admitted. "She was a distraction. Someone who made me feel like I wasn't a failure. Someone who didn't expect anything from me except a good time." Samantha scoffed. "And I expected too much." "No," James said quickly. "You expected what you deserved. And I wasn't man enough to give it to you." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Samantha let out a long breath. "You say you've changed," she murmured. "And maybe you have. But James, I don't know if I can ever trust you again." James felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs, but he nodded, accepting her words. "I understand," he said quietly, "and I won't push you. But whether you trust me or not, I'll be here. For you. For him." Samantha stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of deception. And for the first time in years, she didn't find any. A new beginning. 2 weeks later, Samantha went into labor. James had been working late when he heard her scream from the other room. He rushed in to find her clutching her belly, her face twisted in pain. "It's time," she gasped. James didn't hesitate. He grabbed her hospital bag, helped her into the car, and drove to the hospital as fast as he could. Samantha had always been strong, but James had never seen her like this before, vulnerable, scared, in pain. And all he could do was be there. Hours passed in a blur. Samantha gripped his hand through every contraction, her nails digging into his skin, but James didn't flinch. He whispered words of encouragement, wiped the sweat from her forehead, did everything he could to support her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sound of a baby's first cry filled the room. James's breath hitched. The doctor handed the tiny, wriggling infant to Samantha, and she let out a broken sob as she held him for the first time. "He's perfect," she whispered. James swallowed the lump in his throat. "Yeah," he agreed, his voice shaking. "He is." Samantha looked up at him then, her eyes filled with something James couldn't quite define. "Do you want to hold him?" she asked hesitantly. James's heart nearly stopped. He stared at the tiny bundle in her arms, suddenly terrified. "What if I—" Samantha sighed. "Just take him, James." With trembling hands, James reached for his son. The moment he held him, everything changed. The baby was so small, so fragile, yet so unbelievably real. His little fingers curled around James's thumb, and James felt something inside him crack wide open. A love so fierce, so overwhelming, it nearly knocked him to his knees. James had spent his whole life chasing things: money, power, success. But this was the only thing that had ever truly mattered. He looked at Samantha, tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered, "for giving me him." Samantha watched him, something shifting in her gaze, and for the first time, she didn't look at him with anger. She looked at him with hope. The road ahead. James knew things wouldn't be easy. He and Samantha had a long way to go. There was still pain between them, still wounds that hadn't fully healed. But as he sat in that hospital room, cradling his newborn son in his arms, he knew one thing for certain. He would never walk away again. He wasn't just a businessman. He wasn't just a millionaire. He was a father. And from this moment on, nothing mattered more than that. Samantha exhaled, watching him with a mix of exhaustion and something close to relief. "James," she murmured. He looked up. "Yeah." She hesitated, then whispered, "Don't let us down." James held his son closer and nodded, his voice steady. "I won't." And this time, he meant it.